So our two speakers today are Sucharita Sen and Jennifer Van Horn. Sucharita is a PhD student. She's currently just finished her thesis and submitted it about a month ago and is awaiting her defense, her viva. So huge congratulations to Sucharita, because that's such a big moment of submitting. So huge congratulations. And that PhD project has been done at the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And Sucharita's research interests are around gender studies, colonial history and Indian politics, and she'll be touching upon some of those topics today in her paper, which is Imperial Domesticity, Gender, Space and Intimacies in the Anglo-Indian Household. The second paper will be from Jennifer Van Horn, who holds a joint appointment as Associate Professor in the Departments of Art History and History at the University of Delaware. She's the author of The Power of Objects in 18th Century British America, an absolutely fantastic book that I love to teach with. Her second book, which I'm very excited about, is Portraits of Resistance, Activating Art During Slavery, and that's forthcoming with Yale in August 2022. She also recently co-edited a special double issue of the Winterthur portfolio entitled Enslavement and Its Legacies. And this semester she holds an NEH research fellowship at the Winterthur Museum for work on her current projects. And she's going to be sharing some of those findings with us today in her paper, The Fireplace and Unfreedom, Iron and Enslavement in British North America. But first, we're going to start with Sucharita Sen on Imperial Domesticities. So Sucharita, do you want to share your screen and begin? Fantastic, yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Good evening, good afternoon. I thank the organizers. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present my paper at this prestigious seminar series. My paper explores the intersection and interaction of gender, space, and intimacies in the Anglo-Indian household. The coastline of India has for long been a favorite destination of European commercial endeavors. By the early 19th century, the British East India Company had surpassed its rivals, quelled rebellions, and brought a sizable section of Indian territory under its control. But in 1857 came the Indian Mutiny. The mutiny was suppressed, but since then, the administrative control over India passed on from the hands of the British East India Company to the British Crown. The dominant trend in Indian historiography has been to divide the period of British rule into two broad categories, the pre-mutiny and the post-mutiny, with the latter witnessing strict racial segregation, deterioration of interracial relationships, and increasing regimentation of British social life. My paper challenges this trend of treating the mutiny as a watershed. Instead, the mutiny, I argue, complicated any attempts at universalization of interracial relationships as uniformly hostile. And I do this with the analysis of interracial domestic relationships, which brings us to the Anglo-Indian household, the residence of British imperial families in India. I argue that spaces within the colonial household became sites of both hierarchies and intimacies. Hierarchies were enforced by official injunctions. Intimacies were stimulated by the intricacies and complexities of affect. Personal reflections of the Anglo-Indians have recognized these reciprocal emotions and affections, which often transgressed official colonial frontiers. Colonial space comprised of two aspects: The principle of separation was taken into account in colonial town planning and architecture. There were also the sexualized contact zones. Sexual energies made the East a desirable site where British officers actively engaged in interracial sexual unions. By the 19th century, such sexual alliances were increasingly regimented. As Annie McClintock argues, colonies serves as sites where notions of Europeanness found a self-definition. The interrelatedness of the socially constructed categories of race, class, and gender either aided or hindered colonial self-fashioning. The household and its relationships were officially regulated. It was a domestic space, but it was not free from official intervention. Thus, the household was to reinforce colonial self-fashioning. The official intention was to enable the household to bridge the distance between English home life and life in colonial India. The household thus was to become a sanctum sanctorum away from the perils of interracial sexual unions. But while it was not the sexual space, it also failed to become a white space. The employment of Indian servants who were the primary recipients of the domestic civilizing mission were also impediments in recreating the Britishness of England's cottages. As stated earlier, the maintenance of racial distance was officially desirable, but was nearly impossible to achieve. Thus emerged a new culture, which Anthony King refers to as a third culture. This was a cultural system significantly different from the culture in Britain. Such spaces were shaped by the influence of indigenous culture. In these social spaces, diverse and disparate cultures met, clashed, and grappled with each other. As stated by Mary Louise Pratt, drawing upon Pratt's theorizations, Nandini Sengupta has explored the interactional rather than confrontational aspects of colonial encounters. However, neither of these scholars have treated the contact zones as a sustained and historical process of ongoing relationships. My paper focuses on the household as a non-sexual contact zone, as a continuously evolving and dynamic site of interracial relationships. In particular, the colonial nursery, which housed the future imperial rulers, often breached the racial hierarchies and coexisted with the intimacies coexisted with the hierarchies of the imperial households. The relationships of both power and intimacy varied with architectural spaces. The exhibition of power in the outer space was both actual and symbolic, but in the inner spaces, power relations were often subverted, with the Mem Sahibs retaining symbolic power. The servants largely wielded actual power and problematized racial distance by engendering colonial intimacies. Working at their finest in the outer spaces were the hierarchies of an imperial regime. The relationships between the colonizers and their servants in the drawing rooms and dining rooms were formal. Essential as a display of British prestige and status was the strict observance of hierarchies and etiquettes. Hierarchies in imperial households had a twofold connotation. In the first sense, it indicated the relationship between the colonizers and the colonized. In the second aspect, it meant hierarchy within the same community. In colonial India, both types of hierarchies were conspicuous. Servants were ranked hierarchically according to the status of the masters they served. British officers and their Indian servants were disciplined by hierarchical norms. Indian soldiers of the regiments were not allowed inside the houses of British officers. Occasionally, Lord Dalhousie allowed some old soldiers of his regiment to come and stand, but only in the drawing room. This elevated their status in the eyes of the junior soldiers without defying hierarchical prescriptions which prioritized colonial superiority. British officers received their high-ranking Indian counterparts in well-furnished drawing rooms and verandas, both of which were also used by their wives to entertain ladies of equal rank. In large and influential households, an Indian servant sat in the veranda throughout the day only to receive messages. Officer wives hosted weekly parties in their bungalows and games. Under the Raj, occasions were dictated by the warrant of precedence, which enshrined the imperial code of conduct. No aspect of social life, including who could sit beside at a party, at a dinner table, or who could play with whom in a game, all fell within its purview. Under the company, formal rules of hierarchy governed attendance as well. Women took on the status of their husbands, fathers, or brothers. Based on the seniority of her immediate male relative, women had seats reserved for them at a club. By the conventions of official hierarchy, a game of badminton began only when the senior-most woman, not by age, but by status, served the shuttlecock. At dinner, the first use of the toilet was her privilege. To ensure that they had luxuries and comforts, the sahibs and mem sahibs brought their own servants to the parties. These servants clustered together and fought to procure the first supply of food or drink for their master. In the image, two servants are fighting over a bottle. The outer quarters of the imperial household thus reflected a definitive performance of colonial power. British men and women were the repositories of this power vis-a-vis the colonized subjects. Servants in these spaces became symbolic of the social status of the colonizers and the servitude of the colonized. By contrast, the servant's presence in the inner quarters often led to compassion and intimacy. Anglo-Indian households hosted a number of servants, which was nearly unthinkable in England. The ayah was the Indian counterpart of the European nanny. She was often the only female servant and the most important servant of the Mem Sahib. In houses where there were no children, the ayah became a constant satellite and bodyguard of the Mem Sahib. She reported every improper proceeding among the other servants against whom, whenever necessary, she unhesitatingly sided with her Mem Sahib. On the other hand, the bearer was a Sahib's personal attendant. Both shared intimate bonds of close friendship. The inner quarters of the household gave rise to gendered interracial non-sexual intimacies, especially evident during the mutiny of 1857. On a Sunday morning, discontent spread through the barracks and bazaars of Meerut, a town in colonial North India. Off-duty British officers overlooked the evident signs of unrest among the Indian soldiers. Within a few hours, they had freed their compatriots, commenced a massacre of British officers, and headed towards Delhi. Other stations acted under the domino effect, signaling the onset of the year-long mutiny of 1857. But while the sepoys or Indian soldiers were ransacking garrisons, a British officer sat in his bungalow reading his transfer order to another military station. Less than a decade ago, John Walter Scherer had arrived in India. Since then, Badal Khan had been with him. As a table attendant, Badal was exceptional. That night, Badal prepared his best meal for his sahib. Other servants began arranging his contingency baggage, in which chain of his bag was kept Sherrod's toiletry kit, which side of his luggage hosted his home, and which portion was occupied by his shoes, were all verbally detailed by them. Sherrod felt like a little boy being sent to school by his mother. He was reluctant to carry his valuables. Shortly before departing, he left his valuable family seal with his bearer. In the bearer's custody, Sherrod knew his seal would be safe. Months later, the mutiny was gradually drawing to a close. One afternoon, Nekram, the bearer, reappeared in torn clothes, sunburned and travel-stained. A surprised Sherrod watched as Nekram took off the greasy coils of his turban, brought out the gold seal kept at his disposal, and returned it to Sherrod. Communications had not yet opened up after the mutiny. Nekram had walked through the turbulent countryside only to deliver the seal to its owner. Thus emerged the complexities of interracial relationships. In the early 19th century, young cadet Henry Delamere found his Indian servants delicately clean in their persons and graceful in their motions. In the late 19th century, Sir Walter Lawrence knew that to many people in England, India was the land of regrets. Regrets for the hardships of a life and climate dissimilar to England's, diseases, insects, and mortality rate. But for Lawrence, regrets were for departing from the Indian servants who had been a part of his fortunes in India, their tender sympathy in hardships, and their genuine sorrow at the time of the Sahib's departure from India. Lieutenant Governor Alfred Lyall and his bearer stood on the deck of the ship, looking at one another in a silent, lifelong farewell that was very pathetic. Caressingly, Lyall patted his bearer, slowly turned, and went below. He took his final departure from India. Then there was John Rivet Karnak, another officer departing from an England, reeling under the shock of the mutiny's challenge to her Indian empire. Rivet Karnak sailed with a word of caution to stay away from Indians. For reasons, he was hesitant to trust not the Indians, but the premonitions of his countrymen. Much of his own comforts were at the behest of his bearer. While such intimacies frequently featured in interracial relationships, it was in the colonial nursery that the intimacies peaked. Wherever there were children, ayahs were employed to care for them as well, from infancy to childhood and even beyond. In 1880, The Pioneer, a British-owned English newspaper based in Calcutta, remarked that British children would carry in their hearts the ayah's laughter and tears after all else Indian had passed out of their lives. Anglo-Indian sources constantly reiterate that children loved the company of the Indian servants, particularly for their indulgence in providing a treasury of stories to them. Servants, observed Emma Roberts, sacrificed their gravity and dignity, considered so important to them, to perform clownish activities only to amuse the children. Indian servants, observed Kate Platt, loved European children and were extremely indulgent towards them. Children were, as a rule, happy with the servants, who were wonderfully good at amusing and interesting them. Between Roberts' memoir and the accounts of Platt, there was a gap of many decades punctuated by a violent mutiny. The mutiny affected official racial relationships. However, the inner quarters of the household retained the pre-mutiny status quo. Platt, who visited India after the mutiny, echoed the same sentiments as expressed by Roberts before the mutiny wreaked havoc in India. The love, fondness, and patience of the servants towards the children was proverbial. But Mem Sahibs often accused the ayahs of being extremely indulgent and were unable to discipline the white children. Writing from Madras, Julia Maitland complained that her daughter knew that all she had to do was to make sure that she cried long enough and loud enough, and she was sure to have her way. Still, many Mem Sahibs preferred Indian ayahs over their European counterparts. Roberts found that the latter not only claimed enormous wages, but soon demanded to be themselves attended by Indian servants. Then there were frequent reports about the callousness of the English nurses. Mary Martha Sherwood, an officer wife in 19th century India, remarked how the European nurses remained unaffected by the deaths of neglected infants of the Indian wet nurses. A lady resident once protested against the rough and ready English nursemaids and instead preferred Indian ayahs who were very fond of babies, gentle and patient. Nowhere else, wrote Mary Martha Sherwood, would the European infant encounter such devoted service, such interminable patience, and so many diverting playmates. Since infancy, Louisa Ricketts, Sherwood's 6-year-old daughter, became accustomed to Indian servants, preferring their company to that of the European servants. So did Sherwood's son, who visited temples with his ayah and bearer and came home with his forehead colored with ceremonial powder. Intimacies between the British children and their servants frequently transcended the private space of the nursery to encroach into the public space, where observance of hierarchies was an imperial requirement. Instead of being socialized into becoming the future torchbearers of evangelical imperialism, Sherwood's son enjoyed visits to the shrines of the heathens. At times, even imperious Mem Sahibs questioned the categorization of Indians as heathen. Having resided in India for 22 long years, Flora Annie Steele, wife of a civil servant, was an experienced Mem Sahib and the author of many influential works. Her co-authored housekeeping manual tended to infantilize the Indian servants. Years later, however, Steele published her autobiography, which sat in stark contrast to the advice of her housekeeping manual. Steele had an ayah. With a regal dignity, Fazli, the ayah Steele upheld, was exceptional, unmatched by any trained nurse. Steele's life was beset with difficulties. When her daughter was 6 months old, she had to leave her in the care of a friend. "You leave her in God's care, Mem Sahib," were Fazli's mature words of assurance to her anxious Mem Sahib. Fazli's intelligible insights forced Steele to reconsider the official policy of the civilizing mission. And these are the people we dub heathen. Steele's autobiography bestowed her ayah with all those qualities which were lacking in the Indian servants, should her co-authored manual be followed. Meanwhile, bearers and khidmatgars, the table attendants, formed intimate relationships with their little masters. Lawrence was aware of a youngster, John, who grew up to be placed in charge of a group of sappers. His retired father had advised him, if ever in need, to seek assistance from their long-term servant Habib Khan. Need arose when one night, John and his company had to cross a river by dawn. On the banks of the river stood a perplexed John, unable to locate a ford. As he recalled his father's advice, he proceeded to shout, "Hi, Habib Khan." Within a few minutes from the opposite bank came a joyous response, "Coming, Johnny Baba." Habib Khan came in a boat. Many officers were met often as they arrived in India on the footboard of their ships by bearers who had earlier served their fathers. The affection between the British children and their servants that originated from the nursery transcended many boundaries. Indian servants played patiently for hours with the children, never reproaching them for their crying moods. Infinite was their capacity to invent new games, Sir Lawrence found his own son playing happily with the tailor's razor-sharp shears and was informed, "The baby cried, and I was helpless." Such affectionate relationships permeated British fiction by authors who had lived experiences of India. Sherwood's The History of Little Henry and His Bearer opens by introducing Henry, son of a British officer. After his parents' death, an infant Henry took shelter in the house of an unscrupulous Mem Sahib, who socialized in parties, neglected little Henry, and unnecessarily rebuked her servants. Henry addressed her with endearment as mother or mamma. His custodian hardly reciprocated this affection. Boozy, who had earlier been a bearer of Henry's father, then transferred his allegiance to the neglected child. Boozy nursed him as tenderly as if he had been his own child. Henry was equally fond of Boozy. The first word which Henry tried to utter was the name of his bearer. Boozy's mornings began with providing Henry his breakfast and later placing him in the cot to sleep. Throughout the day, Boozy played with Henry. At the height of his sickness, Henry always found Boozy by his son. As Henry grew up, he loved Boozy more than anyone else in the world. Similarly, in Sarah Duncan's Mutiny novel, a British child, Sony, is saved by the Aya Khidmatgar duo in Sony's house. When Sony's parents are killed, the couple brings him to their house and rears him in disguise. Abdul liked to hear the little fellow call him Bap, which meant father, and to feel his old brown finger clasped by small pink and white ones as he and Soni Sahib toddled into the bazaar together. The fate of the child character penned by Mrs. Henry Paul was similar to that of Soni. Orphaned during the Indian Mutiny, little Frankie grew up under the care of Minatu, his bearer. Although aware of the authority and trust he enjoyed, Minatu never forgot his own position. At dinners, he led Frankie to the dining salon, seated him at the table, and stood behind his chair with the respect which he considered was due to the son of a British officer. But alone, in their little cabin, the two were bound together in a reciprocal affectionate relationship. Such intimacies became even more distinguishable during the mutiny when a stark difference was made between the loyal Indians and the rebel Indians. Nothing on the whole, wrote an officer, could be more praiseworthy than the conduct of the servants of British families and regiments during the mutiny. The bearer, wrote Edmund Hull, continued to be a constant companion and satellite of the Sahib. So was the Aya to her Mem Sahib. Largely defying the civilizing mission came Hull's remark that the much pampered European servants would be astonished by the manners and affection of their Indian counterparts. The neat and methodical servants were anxious to please their masters, proved excellent nurses in times of illness, and took a genuine interest in the well-being of Anglo-Indian families. By the time Hull visited India, interracial distance had gained currency. As the British Raj replaced its predecessor, there were significant changes in the administrative setup. However, changes did not result in the complete removal of Indians from administration because simply it was not feasible. A significant section of Indians continued to serve the British administration even after the mutiny. Nevertheless, monopolization of state power and racial distance gathered momentum. Domestic life remained less impaired by the official changes. Servants were largely immune from suspicion, which could perhaps be attributed to the loyalty they had exhibited during the mutiny. A question regarding the reasons for the servants' loyalty towards the British looms large. Major sections of the Indian population which did not support the mutiny included some Indian rulers and the educated upper and middle classes of colonial Indian society. Princely states which had benefited from the British rule refused to join the revolt. The Sikh states anyway disliked the thought of a possible restoration of Mughal rule. Bengali middle classes had ideological commitment towards a colonial modernity engineered by the British. Reasons for loyalty towards the British ranged from being ideological to political, but vested interests largely reigned supreme. Servants did not belong to any of these classes or communities, ruling out the presence of vested interests. Although we do not have any direct testimony of the servants from their actions as depicted in their masters' narratives, it appears that their loyalty was possibly not ideologically driven or politically motivated. Their loyalty emanated from the generations-old tradition of service embedded in the Indian ethical world of master-mistress-servant relationship, where the servant could never imagine betraying the master whose salt he had eaten. Throughout the period of British rule, I argue it was personal and professional loyalty and interpersonal affection which transcended official distrust. Still, this loyalty could have possibly stirred up during the mutiny. Many servants found their co-workers deserting the families they served, though not all of them joined the rebellion. The scales weighed in favor of occupational loyalty over group ethos. To many servants, sahibs and mem sahibs were their masters and bread givers. Loyal servants thus condemned their rebel counterparts as treacherous. While this interpretation of loyalty is speculative, more urgent for our purpose or the purpose of this research is to understand how Anglo-Indian masters looked at the servants and how these narratives fit into or problematize the imperial notions of race relations. Long ago, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay had shown that loyalty towards the British rule was not without its dilemmas. Subjection to foreign rule resulted in considerable grievances. Being the target of colonial social reforms and other benefits, as stated earlier, many sections did not support the British. Such loyalty emanated nearer from the head than from the heart. In contrast, as this paper has shown, loyalty in household relationships were more personal and emotional. The less educated or even illiterate servants apparently had little understanding of empire, colonization, and self-rules. Benefits of social reform did not accrue to them. They had never been a part of any agenda of social reform. This paper overturns the idea of loyalty, which fitted the educated middle classes and upper sections of the Indian society. Instead, I argue loyalty of the servants sprang nearer from the heart than from the head. This paper thus argues that interracial relationships frequently featured non-sexual intimacies. Intimacies came riding on the complexities of affect, and being non-sexual were correspondingly less regimented. Gender and space interacted with each other in the Anglo-Indian household. Intimacies disturbed but did not dismantle imperial hierarchies. Instead, interracial intimacies existed in tandem with imperial hierarchies. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sucharita, for that paper. That was great. Lots to think about and discuss with that one. So thank you very much for that. And we're going to move straight over to Jennifer's paper, and then we'll have the Q&A afterwards. So Jennifer's going to be speaking on the fireplace and Unfreedom, iron and enslavement in British North America. Thanks so much, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you so much. So let me go ahead and awkwardly share my screen here. Let's see, here we're going. Okay. All right. Looks good. Okay, great. So thank you so much to the co-organizers for inviting me to join you today. And thanks to all of you for making the time to be here. I'm really looking forward to folks' thoughts and feedback. Before I begin, I just want to alert everyone that this lecture will encompass difficult histories and trauma, including the enslavement of people of African origin and descent in the United States, and anti-Black racism. So the historic documents and artworks and artifacts that you'll see promoted racist ideas, some quite overtly, others in ways that are less immediately noticeable. But this material is included to be interrogated and critiqued, not to be promoted. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. George Washington's Virginia plantation, Mount Vernon, where he enslaved approximately 316 men, women, and children, was deliberately imposing, drawing upon design ideas shared by white elites across the British Atlantic. Mount Vernon's portico overlooking the Potomac River attracted most period viewers' attention. But today I'd like to move away from that tantalizing view to the symbolic display at the heart of the plantation's elite domestic interior, and that's the parlor fireplace. Excuse me. As author Robert Clavering enjoined readers in 1779, quote, "A chimney is so agreeable an object that it attracts more than an ordinary share of our attention. And if it's decorated with judgment and taste, it is an elegant ornament." So Washington evidently heeded this directive. Now unknown local craftspeople built and carved the parlor chimney piece and fireplace around in the 1750s, perhaps inspired by books like Abraham Swan's. After the Revolutionary War in the 1780s, when Washington embarked on renovations and new construction, he found the chimney pieces in the parlor and dining room, quote, "so good of their kind as to induce me to lay aside all thoughts of taking them down." But he decided to embellish the parlor fireplace by placing a new iron fire back, or what he called a chimney back, inside. And this was cast especially for Washington in 1787 with his family, quote, crest and cipher. So the addition of the fireback amplified and bookended the carved family crest above the fireplace, which you see there nestled within the chimney piece's broken pediment. And Washington had ordered that crest from a London carver in the 1750s. So it's here with this fireback and other iron objects associated with the fireplace in elite houses in 18th and early 19th century British North America, where we're going to spend our time today. Bearing Washington's doubled mark, this fireback was part of his tremendously successful management of his interlinking personal and political personas. It was a vehicle to demonstrate his genteel taste and also to celebrate his fame as the commander of the Continental Army in the American Revolution and subsequent leadership during the founding of the new American nation. The prevalence of fireplace and chimney piece designs in pattern books and architectural treatises produced in England and circulated around the British Atlantic testified to the prime symbolic importance of this site for the inscription of elite identity. In the North American colonies, as in Great Britain, firebacks had long been used to assert social status, as well as to showcase political and military power and allegiance. So Washington's crest and cipher fireback looked to earlier royal coats of arms, such as this one cast in 1745 in New Jersey and used in a Philadelphia house, and armorial firebacks. And this fireback might have directly influenced Washington, who was often a guest of the wealthy Fairfax family, who owned Belvoir Plantation close to Mount Vernon. And they adorned their fireplaces with these custom firebacks embellished with the Fairfax family's coat of arms. And indeed, after Washington purchased the Fairfax's London-made seating furniture in 1773, when they returned to England, he placed it in Mount Vernon's parlor at the same time that he added the fireback. Given Washington's renown as commander of the Continental Army, his fireback also can be related to those that commemorated military victories. So you're seeing an example here from Massachusetts, memorializing the British military hero of the 7 Years' War, General James Wolfe. And Washington, too, eventually featured on firebacks. This is a Boston-made example cast a year after Mount Vernon's. So here we've got Washington kind of inserted in Wolfe's spot with now American flags and a single cannon. Perhaps, though, the most immediate resonance with the crest and cipher fireback are the many firebacks and stoveplates that celebrated an emerging iconography of the American nation, such as this Great Seal of the United States, or this stoveplate from Berkshire Furnace in Pennsylvania, which draws directly from a political print to show fame, horn raised at the center to declare America victorious. So America represented as a Native American figure on the right, while Great Britain, the female figure on the left, mourns the loss of her colonies. So in the 1780s then, British North American fireplace imagery participated in this national rhetoric of liberty and freedom. And I'm suggesting that broader visual theme with Savage's group portrait painted at about this time on the right. But today I want to invite us to think about unfreedom and the unequal power relationships embedded within and performed through iron domestic objects at the fireplace. So at a global scale, settler colonialism, ecological exploitation, and the transatlantic slave trade intertwined unfreedoms with the movement of wealth, design ideas, and finished goods. In the case of iron, colonial North American pig iron production contributed to British manufacture of iron bars and iron objects that merchants traded with West Africans in exchange for captives. Iron was also then used in the British manufacture of chains and shackles that restrained African captives, especially during the Middle Passage on British slaving ships bound to the Americas and Caribbean. But our focus today is also at a national and local scale, where, as we'll see, cast iron and enslaved people of African origin and descent were materially intertwined through unfree labors of extraction, industrial production, and bodily performance. So this paper is based on my ongoing, and by that I mean really just beginning, research into the relationships between iron, enslavement, and domestic interiors. Objects such as Washington's fireback enable us to reconsider iron objects' symbolic potency within the early British North American interior, and to begin to reconceive of these elite environs as anti-Black spaces, where everyday artifacts played a critical role in white enslavers' attempts to deshumanize Black people and to assert white supremacy. And as I address these questions, I'm indebted to the work of Simon Gikandi, who has powerfully opened examination of the structural and transatlantic relationships between the cultures of taste and enslavement. And I'm also very much inspired by recent critical studies of resource extraction, enslavement, and materiality, including works by Helen Hills, Jennifer Morgan, Anna Arabinden Kesson. And perhaps most immediately, my work intersects with and benefits from Torrance Gatson's scholarship on a fireback in North Carolina. And I also want to highlight Gatson and Tiffany Moman's really important digital history project that's recovering the names and objects made by Black craftspeople in North America. So to begin, I want to start with the fireback's creation. So this fireback was one of 4 that Washington ordered in the summer of 1787. And those were then cast at Batso Furnace in southern New Jersey. The firebacks were puddle cast, a process depicted in Diderot's encyclopedia, with the molten iron poured into molds produced from patterns that were pressed into the sandy floor of the foundry itself. And so for the purposes of this talk, I'll really be focusing on cast iron objects, which differ significantly from the wrought iron works produced by blacksmiths. North American foundry workers produced firebacks alongside iron bars, kettles, stoveplates, andirons, mortars and pestles, and window sash weights, as illustrated and enumerated in Boston foundry owner Joseph Webb's trade card, which you see here. And just to call your attention to what might be a General Wolfe fireback there on the right, and then at the top left, a figural andiron, which we'll return to later. So Batso Furnace, where Washington's firebacks were produced, like most, if not all, of the ironworks in the Mid-Atlantic region, made use of enslaved people's labor. And when I started this research in January, I thought I would be looking for evidence of enslaved people working in these foundries in the Mid-Atlantic. But I've come to realize that, in fact, it would be the rare exception for any iron object produced at a foundry in the Mid-Atlantic in this period not to be the product of unfree Black labor to some degree. Due to the ways foundry owners noted enslaved and free Black men's work in account books, it's often impossible to determine the exact tasks or the amount of skill that they contributed to a foundry. So just for instance, I'm showing you Elk Forge Furnace in Cecil County, Maryland. Forge owner Thomas May recorded only that he rented an enslaved man, Ned, from his enslaver, Mrs. Alexander, for a period of about 6 months, but he gives no indication here of what labor Ned performed during that time. In some cases, we can possibly glimpse traces of skilled enslaved labor in surviving artifacts. Here you're seeing a fireback with a stag design produced at Etna Furnace in southern New Jersey between 1770 and 1774. In September of 74, Charles Reed Jr., the furnace owner, advertised in the Pennsylvania Gazette for the sale of 2 enslaved men, noting one was, quote, a good finer and the other a good hammerman. So both of these men's skilled work was in refining iron, transforming iron ore into the iron used for puddle casting by blooming it, and then heating and hammering it to increase its strength. We know that some skilled bondsmen participated in and even directed the casting process at other furnaces. And of course, the candidates for enslaved people contributing to iron firebacks increases exponentially if we include the men who mined and transported ore, those who cut cordwood, as did a man noted only as, quote, Negro Peter in the accounts of Pine Grove Furnace in Pennsylvania, the men who burned that wood to create charcoal, the men who stalked the fires that fueled the forge's blast. We can also think of enslaved men's labor in transporting the carved wooden patterns from Philadelphia to the Batso Iron Works in southern New Jersey to make Washington's specialty fireback, and then to transport the weighty cast firebacks from New Jersey to Philadelphia and then to Mount Vernon. And here I'm showing you a carved pattern for the Batso furnace that survives for a 10-plate stove. So the national iconography of 1780s firebacks and stoveplates commemorated the formation of a new republic founded on principles of freedom and equality. Many of the enslaved men who labored in mid-Atlantic ironworks had also labored during the American Revolution at these same forges and furnaces when they moved from casting utilitarian domestic and industrial objects to casting cannons and munitions for the Continental Army. And indeed, Charles Pettit, who coordinated Washington's order with the Batso furnace, had earlier helped him obtain cannons from Philadelphia area foundries. And I'm just reminding you of the cannon that you see in the Washington fireback here. So what could the imagery of Washington's fireback have meant to the enslaved men at Batso Furnace who participated in its creation? Perhaps, like the many enslaved people who brought freedom suits in these years, these men believed that the freedom for all promised during the American Revolution indeed included them. And many of these workers grasped freedom for themselves. Due to the demand for their labor and thanks to the harsh working conditions at foundries, some enslaved iron workers wielded power by self-emancipating from one forge and hiring on at another where they could be paid for their labor. And that could be the case with Peter, who we saw earlier at Pine Grove Furnace. Yet in creating the iron for and casting iron objects with symbols of nation embedded in them, Black workers knew this rhetoric of revolution did not legally apply to them. In the same months that workers at Batso Furnace made Washington's cipher and crest fireback, he presided over the Constitutional Convention, and in that role promoted and defended the institution of slavery and the denial of full Black legal humanity. The compromise that members of the Constitutional Convention famously reached in 1787 held that enslaved people counted not as voting citizens, but as 3/5 of a person in calculating a state's population for purpose of representation in Congress. 2 years after Batso workers produced the cipher and crest fireback, Washington became the first president, and in that role asserted enslavers' power by signing into law the Fugitive Slave Act that put a legal system in place for enslavers or their agents to seize fugitives and made it illegal to aid them. In private, Washington had begun to question whether slavery was beneficial to the United States. But despite such moral probing, the president and Congress excluded African Americans from citizenship and upheld their status as property. An action that, together with the Fugitive Slave Act, would have had an immediate impact on and relevance for self-emancipated iron workers. So we've thought about the fireplace as a status symbol and bearer of a complex iconographic meaning. But now I'd like to consider the fireback's function and use within Mount Vernon as a site of unfree labor. The purpose of any fireback was twofold. First, to protect the bricks that formed the fireplace from heat exposure and thereby damage. And second, to hold and then to radiate the heat generated by a fire. And we can see the heat damage caused to firebacks themselves in the pitting and splitting at the bottom of firebacks like this one. Through its tapered shape, which decreased in thickness toward the top, firebacks also helped to channel smoke up a chimney. So the fireback was part of a constellation of objects required for fire maintenance and the chimney's effective functioning. And you can see these artifacts delineated in Boston artist Henry Sargent's rendering of a dinner party. So namely tongs, a poker, a rake, or hearth brush, and bellows, as well as a pair of andirons, sometimes known as fire dogs, which raise logs off the hearth, thereby protecting it and allowing for greater airflow. I just had to pull in this earlier fireback from the V&A collection, which really playfully suggests the visual and often material linkages between andirons and firebacks, which occupied the same physical space within a fireplace and were often cast at the same foundries. So, of course, missing from Franklin's list is the labor that animated these objects. At Mount Vernon and other houses across British North America, enslaved domestic workers kept fires burning for the physical comfort and visual needs of their enslavers. A mid-18th century genre painting from France provides a rare glimpse of a Black man tending a fire in a parlor. Dressed in livery and wearing an exotic turban, the attendant might be free or enslaved by a French planter with Caribbean holdings. A log gripped between his hands, he kneels before the hearth, reaching his upper body into the fireplace. The fire tongs that rest on the ground beside him and the bellows placed on the mantelpiece above suggest his ongoing efforts to keep the logs aflame. At fireplaces across North America, Black people's hands stocked fireplaces, lit and tended the fires that consumed wood, brushed ash away from firebacks and andirons. Enslaved people were also charged with caring for fireplace equipment. Rebecca Jane Grant, enslaved in Beaufort, South Carolina in the 1850s, recalled polishing her enslavers' brass andirons each day as an 8-year-old girl. And other Works Progress Administration interviews suggest that enslavers often tasked Black children with sweeping hearths and readying fireplaces each morning. While brass andirons required polishing to retain their luster, enslaved domestic workers also coated iron to help protect the surface from rust and heat damage and to impart a shine. Charles Pettit, who arranged Washington's fireback order, instructed him about the fireback's care. Quote, "After scrubbing the faces with a hard brush, a coat of black lead mixed with whites of eggs and a little sugar and water will embellish their appearance." That treatment would have been undertaken and repeated by enslaved domestic servants at Mount Vernon. Perhaps butler Frank Lee, who was tasked with painting the plantation's buildings' interior and exterior walls, or enslaved housemaids Carolyn Brandman, Molly, and Charlotte. So looking at the high relief designs of many cast iron firebacks in light of Black labor, these uneven topographies gained different meanings as their protuberances posed hazards for those who had to be wary of brushing against their hot surfaces and offered crevices for soot and ashes to collect. So even though the fireplace was a site for the proclamation of white male identity and political power, within the race and class spaces of elite domestic interiors, it also bore an association with enslaved domestic workers of African origin and descent. This conflation of enslaved people with the fireplace and the iron objects deployed there stemmed in part from their assigned work within and before it. but it was also shaped by and helped to inculcate white elites' racist assumptions about Black people's presumed inhumanity or objecthood. Sargent's painting suggests the conflation of a Black waiter or butler with fire equipment. The artist's placement of the Black figure near the fireplace in line with the andirons asserts a commonality between the artifacts and the butler, whether enslaved or free is unclear. With his gold-toned jacket and round head, the Black figure formally recalls the columnar brass andirons, an indicator of their shared status as part of a display and work unit dedicated to white elites' comfort. A set of andirons in Winterthur Museum's collection explicitly and disturbingly tied white fantasies of Black service and subservience to iron objects used in the fireplace. These unmarked andirons were produced sometime in the second half of the 18th century at an unknown iron foundry on the East Coast. Both andirons, and we see one from the front and one turned to the side, feature identical, seemingly adolescent boys of African origin. Legs splayed and arms bent, the figures grasp the neck of a wine bottle or decanter in one hand and the stem of a wine glass in the other, indicating their imagined role as stand-ins for Black domestic workers. The andiron's duplication of the figures, necessary for their function as log supports, points to the unknown pattern carver's likely visual source, and that is the woodblock prints that marked announcements of slave auctions in newspapers, such as the 1780s announcement from Charleston. In this ad, as in the andirons, the depicted Black figures mingle Western fantasies of African and Indigenous peoples with their grass skirts and, in the ad, headdresses. The placement of these Black figural andirons literally within the fire's flames points to racist period assumptions about Blackness. European, British, and American natural historians claimed that the African continent's tropical heat combined with African people's presumed moral lackness to produce dark skin, and enjoined their readers that Black people were capable of enduring high temperatures without complaint or physical harm. Blackness also correlated with racist ideas about enslaved people's supposed lack of cleanliness and propensity for intemperate, and I should put intemperate in quotes there, responses, thought to be enhanced by a warm climate. So fireplaces, iron fireplace equipment, and enslaved people of African origin and descent then became connected through the shared negative qualities that white elites assigned to all. Unfreedom here then appears again in enslaved people's inability to overtly reject the anti-Blackness that bound them to fire in white elites' perceptions without fear of reprisal. Fireplaces carried strong associations in the 18th century with discomfort and ill health, marked by, quote, gross, unctuous, and weighty smoke that offended the eyes and damaged the furniture, as Benjamin Franklin described. Descriptions of African skin as painted Black or darkened with oils explicitly connected this Black colored clinging residue of soot to enslaved people. An It narrative published in Godey's Lady's book in 1839 insisted on fireplace equipment's dirtiness and uncivil associations. The author imagined a conversation between fireplace implements and more, quote, refined objects in a parlor, such as a bookcase and pier glass. Here, the great hearth brush and tongs are characterized as rough, belligerent, and unclean artifacts, peppered with soot and singed, in keeping with their harsh treatment, consisting of, quote, hard knocks and sometimes a poke. When the hearth rug laments that the hearth brush, quote, leaves the marks of your smutty fingers, the tongs report, quote, you complain of the dirt. Now just look at my face. Why they send me head foremost into the coal every day. Though cast in supposedly humorous terms, the association of Blackness with soot, smoke, and heat was more sinister. So it's horrifying then, but not surprising, that fireplaces became zones for anti-Black violence. And I'm going to show you next an account in which some of that violence is narrated. So multiple accounts published by self-emancipated and newly freed Black people from the 19th century American South attest that enslavers, male and female, brutalized bondspeople before hearths with fire tools ready to hand. And you're reading one such account here. Such gruesome narratives of endemic abuse established the fireplace as a site for brutality and the assertion of white power. At Mount Vernon, the pairing of enslaved people with the production of heat extended beyond Washington's parlor. At the same time that he ordered the crest and cipher fireback, Washington also ordered 2 large and plain firebacks from the Batso Furnace for heating his newly constructed greenhouse. And what you're seeing is a reconstruction of that original building on its foundations. Built in 1787, that structure consisted of a greenhouse or orangerie fronted by formal gardens on one side, and on the other side, new quarters for the enslaved people who lived closest to the main house, a group of approximately 50 to 75 people that included skilled and domestic workers. At the heart of this new building was a stoveroom that provided the heat Washington's palms, lemon and orange trees, and other tropical plants required to survive Virginia winters. Enslaved men and boys cut and split extensive quantities of wood to fuel the stove in the back corner of this room, which you're seeing. Hot air from the stove then flowed through a series of flues and pipes into the greenhouse floor behind. Keeping the fire going night and day required constant tending, and an enslaved man or boy thus stayed in this room from late fall to early spring. As you can see in both the insurance drawing on the top and Washington's sketch as he was putting forth his design for the structure, the stoveroom sat at the center of enslaved people's quarters. So it was bracketed on either side by 2 rooms that were equipped with berths or bunks for sleeping, and where enslaved people cooked and ate in the winter. These flanking 1-story wings then also helped to insulate the greenhouse from cold outside air. Mount Vernon's enslaved domestic workers lived, in effect, in a fireplace, an architecture designed to use their bodily warmth and daily activities of cooking and sleeping to keep exotic plants alive for Washington's and his visitors' enjoyment. So Unfreedom shaped the industrial production of iron and iron objects at North American forges and characterized the domestic labor of fire maintenance at Mount Vernon and similar elite domestic interiors. But a materially grounded and phenomenologically attentive history of Washington's fireback and bondspeople's experiences with iron objects also reveals the tenacity of Black freedom despite attempts to assert white supremacy. So I want to conclude by thinking about the Black agency also exercised at the fireplace. Thus far, I've not found explicit evidence of the fireplace being a site for Black freedom until the Civil War. In her WPA interview, Mandy Coverson, who was enslaved in North Carolina, claimed that her enslaver was moving large brass andirons, which she had polished, to protect them from the Union Army when he hurt his back and died. For Coverson, the heavy andirons were a symbol of her enslaver's desire to retain the genteel possessions made possible by enslaved labor, including that of her mother. In her telling, Coverson's emancipation was interwoven with the andirons' perceived refusal to cooperate. Inverting racist associations of Blackness with the fireplace's soot and equipment, Coverton saw her enslaver's disastrous intrusion into this space and his unskilled interaction with these objects as proof of the social and political upheaval of the Civil War, one with which she ultimately could not cope. Her narrative suggests the ways that within bondage, Black makers and users' production of and daily interactions with iron objects might have similarly enabled them to deviate from and articulate new messages different from those white enslavers expected or intended, moving us away from the idea of the chimney as elegant ornament to a sense of its extraordinary and contested political power within the domestic interior. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks so much. Stop sharing. Okay.
That was wonderful. Thanks so much, Jennifer. So much to think with there. Thank you. So thank you so much to Jennifer and to Sucharita for those really rich and fascinating papers. And I think they've both really illuminated the importance, really, I guess, of domestic spaces in terms of the production, gauging, and negotiation of power relations in bodily, emotional, and in material terms. So a couple of questions for me, and then we'll kind of have space, of course, for questions from you, and I hope there are plenty of them. So if you want to ask a question, then please do pop it in the chat or put your hand up so that we can see. So the first is really for you, Sucharita, to think about. Thanks so much for the fascinating paper in terms of thinking about the nature of these power relationships between servants, ayahs, and British families on the Indian subcontinent, and particularly the ways in which those changed or were shaped by this moment of watershed, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, really kind of thoughtful piece for us to respond to. And I think my kind of main question is really about whether it's possible to kind of speak from sources that give us some sense of the perspective of servants and ayahs themselves, and the way in which they were understanding and experiencing the intimacies that you've alluded to, particularly in terms of kind of bodily intimacies, but also emotional intimacies, as you referred to. So it'd be great to hear as to the extent to which we can speak to, or perhaps rather listen to, the perspectives of servants and ayahs on those relationships. And then Jennifer, so many kind of questions again from your paper in terms of thinking about the different levels of the materialities at stake in these objects, both in terms of extraction, production, and then finally use. So I guess one of my questions, a couple of kind of maybe one small question and then a slightly bigger one. The first is really about the materiality of these objects, particularly the fireplates, and the kind of question of permanence that you alluded to. So while they are changed by fire, they also withstand it. And there's something there perhaps about the longevity that's attached to these houses more broadly, and the kind of interiors within them, and what that idea of permanence and longevity means for these objects and the kinds of symbolic weight they can carry. And then the second is really, I guess, what you were speaking about just at the end of the paper in terms of the fireplace, and perhaps fire more broadly as a site of resistance, as a kind of powerful tool to be used in processes of resistance, and whether the kind of more fraught and contested nature of fire is actually something that comes out in the sources at all. So perhaps Sucharita, if we start with you, and quite a big question. I'm sorry, I'm sure you're kind of covering this in the thesis more broadly, but can you, is it possible to kind of speak more about the perspective of the servants and the ayahs themselves?
So thank you so much for the question. Throughout my research, I think that's one of the limitations that I have faced, that these servants were mainly the illiterate, or even if they were literate, they were like really very semi-literate sections of the society. So I wouldn't expect a lot of them to have their own voices at the archives. So that could be one limitation, because the way I am perceiving the interracial intimacies is actually how the Anglo-Indians are looking at them. But as we see from a number of subaltern studies works that are coming up that have been coming up over the last couple of decades, is that the subaltern voices are not always there at the archives, but it is possible to look at, for example, in my research, it is possible to look at the Anglo-Indian views on them and look at their behavior and then interpret that behavior as text to ultimately reach the minds of the servants. So that is what basically I'm trying to do, because I do not have much of the servants' voices at the archives. What is there with this presentation is a section of one of my chapters. in the other chapters, I have also looked at Indian soldiers and their relationships beyond the household, that is in the battlefield and the tramping grounds of India. So some of the soldiers' documents are there at the archives, particularly there were, if we see the British Library archives, there are numerous letters of these Indian soldiers because they were part of the British Indian Army, as well as when after the mutiny, there were certain depositions which were taken at the mutiny ravaged sites. So the court proceedings has the testimonies of Indian soldiers or people who were belonged to the court of the erstwhile Indian rulers. But my entire purpose of the thesis is to see how the Anglo-Indians are looking at the servants and the soldiers and how they are interpreting the intimacies, because my aim, it's a slightly a lofty aim, but my aim is basically to kind of unearth a sort of a parallel discourse, because we see the universalization of interracial relationships as very hostile. But here I'm trying to bring out an exchange which is more cordial and interracial intimacies alongside the hierarchies. So yes, to answer your question, that is one limitation of the research, which I have admitted throughout, I think, the thesis.
No, thank you so much for that. And yeah, absolutely. It's always such a difficult thing with those sources. And I think it's really interesting how you're trying to read the sources from the Anglo-Indian family sort of against the grain to understand the complexities of these intimate relationships that you showed so fully. So thanks so much. Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you for those great questions as well. So I will admit to kind of having just completed a project that was really relentlessly about the portrait. It is both wonderful to come back to a world of objects that have more material dimension, but also really kind of, I feel that stutter step of like, oh, it's not flat. I'm not used to looking at these, or I haven't been accustomed to looking at them for a while. So your thoughts about permanence are very welcome. I'm now thinking about all these object files that I've been reading, talking about the conservation efforts, because there's masonry or sort of bits of concrete on the back of a lot of these firebacks, right? And so implying that kind of line between architecture and object, and how those are seamlessly coming together at that site. Yeah, I have not thought a lot about fire and resistance, and now that you've said that, that makes total sense. I'm even thinking about, you know, Charles Wilson Peel goes to Mount Vernon right after the Haitian Revolution moment, and says that there's rumors about enslaved people setting the fire, you know, setting the house on fire, which does not happen, right? But just that kind of constant threat that's implied with the possession of fire and access to it, and that's certainly something that I should think about more. So thank you so much for that comment. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, I guess, where my objects are in a sense, because along with permanence, right, there's this constant ephemerality of fire and of chimneys and of this relationship. And so I think that where I'm headed is reading a lot more about soot, because soot is this is really geeky, but so interesting. So I always thought of soot as just being the black gook that kind of is left after, you know, there's been the carbon and then it's there. And it is, but there's also, soot is what actually gives color to a flame. So if a flame did not have kind of carbon contamination, it's like gas flame, like blue, right? But it's actually soot that gives it the yellow orange color. So I spent a lot of time in this moment sort of thinking about if we're trying to originate blackness then with fire, like what is that moment then of blackness appearing or disappearing? And so it's fascinating to me that sort of soot is at the heart of what makes the entire thing flammable. and how ephemeral that is, right? That lingers but doesn't persist. So definitely thinking something, and I'm not sure how it will all shake out, but along with permanence and longevity, there's that continual tension with ephemerality, and then a constant kind of desire to purge and to clean. Yeah, thank you. That's super helpful.
It's really, really interesting to think about, yeah, the soot as a kind of material element in itself, and the kind of role that plays, and the color schemes that are involved in the flame itself. Really, really interesting. And actually thinking about that question of kind of temporality also makes me think about your work, Sucharita, in terms of thinking about how the kind of longevity, you talked about kind of the loyalty, and it makes me think about the kind of longevity or not of some of these relationships as well. And thinking particularly, about the movement of Ayahs with British families back to Britain, and then often abandoned, of course, and having to kind of make recourse to the stranger's home there. So where these relationships go and how long they last is also really interesting. Is that something that you've tracked at all? Sorry, and then Amy, will come to you. So sorry, I'm on a roll now. Sucharita, have you been able to track the length of some of these relationships at all?
Yes. So when I was looking at the sources, not all sources are talking about the relationship beyond the colonies, but I have had, at least if I take a statistical count for that way, at least 5 to 6 sources among the many other sources. I know it's a very insignificant amount, but basically I have not focused on beyond relationships beyond the colony. But there were like Mary Ann Faber, Mary Hobhouse, and Elizabeth Garrett. They are all actually saying that some of them speculate on taking their bearers with them. And another section, particularly Mary Ann Faber, who owed their lives to the servants, their Ayah and Khidmat, Ayah and bearer, who were this Soni and Pachkori. These two servants, they saved the Faber family during the mutiny. And the Faber personal memoir, it ends with the paragraph that Mrs. Faber, that I'm sitting in my drawing room in England, and right there in the garden, my children are playing with Sonia and Pachkori. So that was there. But yes, the Ayahs were also abandoned. I think the Hackney Museum in London deals with the abandoned Ayahs. I haven't yet gone into that aspect, because that would have taken me beyond the confines of the colony. So I'm just focused, because there are also Ayahs who are traveling from India to other parts of the British Empire, like not just England, but also Australia and other parts. So, but I'm not focusing on the Ayahs in transit. Though there is a work that is being done, I think, in Australia about the Ayah's home. Yes, Amy, thank you so much. The Ayah's, the work that is being done. So I have not focused on that, but I'm mainly focusing on the relationships in India. But yes, there were instances of the Ayahs and bearers accompanying their masters to England.
That's so interesting as well, that for the Faber memoir, it's the kind of the last scene, the last moment, and that's really, really interesting. Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, I just thought it was easier to ask it verbally than fill the chat with my typos. I was going to ask Sucharita exactly what you just asked about the Ayahs and the long-term relationship, but I also have a question for Jennifer, which was about, I wondered, thinking particularly about the image that you began and ended your presentation with of the entire fireplace at Mount Vernon, where the fireback is set into quite an elaborate carved surround, and also the overmantel painting. And I wondered if you were intending to extend your research to look at other aspects of the fireplace to see if that narrative continues through into the other elements. Or I mean, I know obviously you're researching iron and therefore that takes that away, but I was just wondering how that kind of fits into the whole surround, because it's such a kind of not only a visual focal point, but such a symbolic focal point, not only for the room, but for the household as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The short answer is I don't know yet. I think I've been reading a lot of sort of, architectural treatises and pattern books and kind of, how to go about building the perfect fireplace and make your chimney piece look the way it ought. And so I have been weirdly, I guess, and insistently kind of reading those looking for iron, just because so much of the iron that shows up in them is kind of incidental. I mean, it's sort of, it's like, oh yeah, you need a nail here, or you need a joist here, but it's not explicitly invoked as part of a kind of program, decorative program. So yeah, I think I need to think a little bit more about how those pieces do fit together. And for sure, I think, in Washington's case, the fireback comes in as this last kind of, I'm going to keep everything. I like the way it worked, and I'll just supplement a little bit with this fireback in a sense. So he's definitely seeing those components as being related. I think one of the reasons the fireback itself I find so interesting is because if we are thinking at the kind of level of where people who are taking care of fires are operating, that's going to be the most kind of loud speaking object in a sense, right? In a way that as you walk in and you're at standing height, you're going to be perceiving much more of the, an overmantel painting or the kind of really beautiful architectural surround. So I think in part I've been deliberately looking down to try and kind of keep within a visual register that's happening a little bit lower. Yeah, but that's a great question. And I think absolutely I don't see a dissonance between, usually between what's happening with the fireback and what's happening in other spots and places. And certainly it's somewhere like Mount Vernon, there's this huge symbolic campaign that Washington's waging through ceiling design and through mantle pieces elsewhere. So he's clearly aware of an integrated kind of interior. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
Great, thanks. We have, I think, one final question from Lewis in the chat. Jennifer, if you can see that's for you in terms of thinking about iron and this acknowledgement of the presence of the enslaved and whether that's possible.
That's a great series of questions, Lewis Nelson. Thank you. No, I'm writing those down. Do you want to say anything, Lewis?
No, both papers were fantastic. They have my mind really sort of spinning. I do think that there's always a useful comparison between Washington and Jefferson as well as Madison, just in terms of normative behaviors. I think the exclusion of rough items in Jefferson's spaces I think that you'll find actually less cast iron in Jefferson spaces than Washington's, and I think that's actually kind of interesting because generally Jefferson is actually trying to mask, and I think that's not an actual masking, but sort of a psychomoral attempt to diminish the moral burden of the visibility of enslavement. And I think that, Washington's actually just more typical, which I think actually it might be helpful for you to bring in a little Jefferson just as a way of demonstrating that the vast majority of America in this period is Washington's certainly at the elite end of that, but he's a little more normative. And then I'm also just really, I've been, because of this seminar and others, I'm just really reading a lot around the emergence of race theory and sort of the developments of race theory in the middle of really beginning the 1740s to the 1780s and 90s. And there is an emerging popular literature around constructions of race and the delimiting of intellectual capacity, aesthetic capacity by race, and these things become the hierarchy. And so I'm wondering how much the inclusion of cast iron, I mean, so you make a compelling argument that cast iron, and I think of course shackles is an obvious connection here. Cast iron is emblematic, is a surrogate for, in some way, the collection of